I cannot tell you, Bronco Nation, how excited I am to be sitting down with you doing this video, because it means that the offseason is over and Boise State football is back. This is going to be an incredible season. There are so many expectations for this year, and I think part of the reason there's so many expectations is that so much has happened in this offseason that it didn't really feel like an offseason. I mean, of course it did, because there's not Boise State games to watch every week, but there was always news for coming out for Boise State football on almost a weekly basis, whether it was Ashton Jeanty coming back, or huge recruits coming in, or coaches being hired, coaches leaving, coaches coming in. This offseason is built up to a point where I think we are truly ready to see something great out of Boise State, and it all starts week 1 versus Georgia Southern. This is a game at 2 p.m. Mountain Time on ESPNU. So, for those not familiar with my Boise State 3 Keys to the Game preview videos, this is not just going to be about Boise State. If there's any Georgia Southern fans watching, there will be stuff in here for you. Boise State fans, this is now a chance to learn about Georgia Southern, this first week opponent for Boise State. We're going to go through the overall just kind of summary of what this game is, where it is, when it is. I've done a little bit of that already. Then we'll talk about series history between these two teams. We'll talk about key players for both Boise State and Georgia Southern, 3 key players for both of them. And then I'll go through keys to the game for Boise State, ending with a overall review and giving you a score prediction. So, as always, before you continue with the rest of this video, stop right now and go into the comment section and give me your score predictions. I'm going to want to go through and see all of those score predictions. And this year, what I'm going to be doing is whoever gets the closest score prediction, I will give them a shout out in the next video. So it's not much, but I love seeing those score predictions. I love interacting with all of you. This is a great opportunity for me to be able to engage with the fan base, and I want to continue to encourage those. So whoever's closest will get a shout out in the video next week for when I preview the Oregon game. If there's multiple people that have the same one, it'll just be whoever posted it first. So get in there right now. Make sure you pause the video and give me your score predictions. Whether you're a Boise State fan or you're Georgia Southern, you want to go predict the upset, go give us those score predictions in the comments below. All right, so let's get into previewing this video. Again, Boise State versus Georgia Southern. 0-0, first game of the season, but just looking at their record last year, Boise State, of course, 8-6, but if you just looked at the record for Boise State, that does not tell the full story of what happened last season. Obviously, completely different end to how that season was going at the beginning and even at the midpoint. And then Georgia Southern, a team that went 6-7. It was their second year in a row, going 6-7 under their third-year head coach. And that is another storyline for this game. Third-year head coach for Georgia Southern with Clay Helton. He's really going to try and bring out the full potential of Georgia Southern this year. He's had 2 back-to-back years of getting them bowl eligible, and now they're ready to take that next step. Phil Steele has this Georgia Southern team as a program that could compete for the Sun Belt Conference Championship game. Boise State, on the other end, even though they're sitting there with a brand new first-year head coach, he has some experience coming back from last year, obviously, where he ended up stepping into that interim role. So Boise State head coach Spencer Danielson, first season opener as the head coach, but Boise State on their end is also a program that's being looked at as not just winning potentially the conference, but also a team that's going to compete potentially for that Group of 5 playoff spot as well. So, series history between these two teams. Oh, and just to finish wrapping up that first bit there, like I said, 2 p.m. Mountain Time on ESPNU. Boise State is favored in this game, given a 13-point favorite per Vegas, and then ESPN also has them favored by giving them a 65.1% chance of winning this game. So, Boise State the favorites, but should this be a game that Boise State fans should be concerned about? A little heads up here. Yes, this is not a team that we can overlook, and we'll talk about that when we get into the 3 keys to the game, but let's look at the series history. All right, this section will be really fast because there is no series history between Boise State and Georgia Southern. First ever meeting. However, just looking at Boise State's record versus Sun Belt teams overall, they've actually never lost to a Sun Belt team in their FBS history. And I've only played a few of them. Idaho, when they were in the Sun Belt in the early 2000s, they've played UL Lafayette, and they've played Troy, and they've won against all of those teams. So Georgia Southern with a chance here to make a little bit of, well, not a little bit, this would be huge for them, obviously, to make history by potentially being the first team to go out and beat Boise State. Can they do it? That's what we're going to talk about here in this video, obviously, and it'll come down to the key players for both Boise State and Georgia Southern to determine who ends up with the win in this one. So for the key players for Boise State, number one, I think nobody's going to be surprised by the number one key player for the game, Ashton Jeanty. Ashton Jeanty is the heart and soul of this offense for Boise State. Over 1,300 yards rushing last year, over 500 yards receiving, and that is with both going through an injury where he missed a couple of games and also not being the number one back. I mean, it was kind of a number one split. Boise had two number one backs with George Holani and Ashton Jeanty, but in the back half of the season, when George Holani came back healthy, they were splitting reps pretty much 50-50. So even without being the only feature back in the offense, Ashton Jeanty still did what he was able to put up last year, and we are expecting a huge year, a much bigger year as the number one back for this Boise State offense. And Boise State's hopes and dreams, maybe not necessarily coming up against Georgia Southern, but overall for the season, their hopes and dreams on what they can do if they can fulfill some of the highest expectations, some of the loftiest predictions, some of the loftiest predictions for this program. They're going to need Ashton Jeanty to have not just a huge game, but a huge season, but it all starts with Georgia Southern. My second key player of the game is going to be Latrell Caples. Now, this is a different story. Ashton Jeanty, we all know about him, what he did last year. He's going to be riding that momentum into the season. Latrell Caples, he's restarting this year. Last year, injured. Year before that, he was a leading wide receiver for Boise State. Now, it was a down year for wide receivers overall, but he had 549 yards receiving, averaged 10.8 yards per reception, and that was in 2022. And like I said, led the team in receiving. He's going to be huge for this program, not just because he brings senior leadership to this role, and he is a very exciting offensive threat that we definitely missed last year, but also playing out of that slot receiver role. I think he's going to be a heavy target for a Boise State passing game that is going to be under the hands of Maddox Madsen, who I'm excited about, but he's also a young, inexperienced guy. Got a little tested last year, but still overall inexperienced. And so Latrell Caples in that slot role provides a good outlet route, and he's a guy, like I said, 10.8 yard average per catch. He can get you yards after catch. He's going to be a major player both in the receiving game and in the return game, showing that shiftiness. And then finally, the last key player for Boise State is going to be Amarion McCoy. 31 tackles last year, 4 passes defended, 3 interceptions, really came on strong at the end of the year. He's one of the best defenders in the secondary for Boise State. This third key player really represents the secondary overall because the entire secondary is such a huge key, and we'll talk about that when we get to the actual keys of the game. But for Marion McCoy, I expect him to have a huge year, and coming up against a Georgia Southern team that's a very pass-heavy program, you're going to want Marion McCoy to have a huge game to be able to shut down that Georgia Southern passing attack. So talking about Georgia Southern, 3 key players for them. Well, obviously, the number one key player for any offense is usually going to be the quarterback. Obviously, Boise State, it's the running backs of our situation that we have going on with Ashton Jeanty being a legitimate Heisman candidate and obviously a young, untested face at quarterback. Offense will run through Ashton. However, Georgia Southern, they're not that way. They have a new face at quarterback, but they're not a team that can rotate and switch to a run-focused attack. This is a very pass-centric offense for Georgia Southern, and so for them, it's going to be J.C. French. Now, he was not the starter last year. Their starter last season, Davis Brin, he threw for over 3,000 yards, almost 4,000 yards passing. He was a huge element for them being able to have the success in offense that they did last year. If they're going to continue to have that success and turn the corner and having a better season this year, J.C. French is going to have to step up. It was a quarterback battle. He wasn't the starter all the way through. He's pretty inexperienced. He only had 16 attempts for 122 yards, a touchdown, and a pick last year, but he has a big arm. This is a guy who can definitely step in and fill a role in a pass-centric offense, but he's also going to have to rely on that running game. Georgia Southern, not a run-first team, but they do have a good running back coming back in Jalen White, 889 yards rushing, 9 touchdowns, 5.6 yard average, and with an inexperienced quarterback behind center, you're going to have to lean on that running back room a little bit more, and so Jalen White's going to be a big asset for them. However, when they do go to the air, wide receiver Darren Burgess, and I may be messing up some of these players' names, so please correct my pronunciation in the comments, any Georgia Southern fans watching, but Darren Burgess, he is going to be that number one target for Georgia Southern in the passing game. He was second last year in receiving, only about 100 yards-ish short of being the number one receiver in yards overall. So second, but not he's still one of those top guys for this team offensively. 813 yards receiving, 11-yard average, had over 60-yard long reception, and he also led the team in receiving touchdowns with 6 touchdowns. So for J.C. French, this is the guy he's going to be leaning heavily on in his passing game, just like Latrell Caples will be a big emphasis early on for Maddox Madsen. Now, keys to the game for Boise State. Not going to do Georgia Southern keys to the game, so you'll have to interpolate from these. But for Boise State, keys to the game, the number one, I've touched on it already, is going to be that secondary. The secondary needs to step up. This is really a season key for Boise State overall. Obviously, much maligned secondary last year. Some of those losses was definitely on the secondary, especially opening up against Washington State. But I mean, I guess, playing Michael Penix, what was going to happen? He was going to blaze really any secondary, and he did throughout the year that was placed before him, but especially that Boise State secondary. But Boise State, they've done some things to make themselves better this year. Part of that is just the experience. Last year, they lost so many players across the board. I believe it was 8 out of their 12 top tacklers, 7 or 8 out of their top tacklers, returned only 40% production defensively last year. It was a real rebuild for them, and it was to be expected that they were going to have a little bit of a dip. But this year, just like JL Skinner said when he came on and previewed the defense with me, what they needed to do most to fix last year was just get the experience, and they did. So they have a really experienced core coming back, and we'll touch on some of those guys. But what they also did is they made some really big offseason moves. So I know that Malachi Nelson was a huge focus point of the recruiting this off cycle, and talking about bringing in new talent, and Malachi Nelson was kind of the head of that. But Boise State wasn't just going off the offense. They brought in 2 really solid defensive players, in Jeremiah Irby, who looks to be a starter, and then also Banks from Washington. He was a defensive back for Washington. He was one of their main guys, got hurt early on in the year. If he can come back and be fully healthy, and it looks like he is, he's going to definitely be a major contributor for the Boise State secondary and can step up big. But again, it's not just the new guys coming in. The guys coming back from last year have a lot more experience. I'm really expecting big things out of Tubner, Benisfield, McCoy, Oladipo, and then even behind them, Reed, Kaniho, Robinson. There's even some other faces that we haven't seen much of, but I think will step up. Overall, this is a much more experienced Boise State secondary, and it's a Boise State secondary that doesn't just have the star talent, but has built so much more depth throughout, from first string all the way down to second, third. There are a lot of guys that can step up and perform at a high level, and I'm expecting big things out of this Boise State secondary. And again, it all starts with beating a team that's a pass-centric team in Georgia Southern. You're going to need that secondary to step up. And more than anything, you're going to need to build them that confidence for when they go out and play Oregon, who is going to be even a bigger test the following week. And it all starts week 1 by going up against Georgia Southern and beating them with our secondary. Now, key number 2 here is embrace the Genty system. Last year, everybody that I brought on for the Boise State offensive preview said, yeah, we agree with you. It's going to be a run-centric offense. We thought it was going to be a run-centric offense because you had the double-headed backs of Genty and Holani. Behind them, you had Dubar, who was capable as well. And then you had, obviously, Taylor Green, who was such a running threat. Everybody assumed that it was going to be a run-centric offense last year. I mean, even that's what we were seeing in spring ball. And then we came out, and it wasn't that at all. And so this year, Boise State, everything we've seen has been that it's going to be run-centric. You would think that it's going to be run-centric when you've got Genty, when you've got Dubar, when you've got Sire Gaines. I mean, that second position for Boise State, I think it's going to be pretty fluctuating between Dubar and Gaines getting in the game. When the offensive line, 4 out of 5 starters coming back on offensive line, this is going to be a dominant run game. Boise State, though, they've always wanted to be that balanced attack. But you have got to come in and establish the running game. Yes, this is a very exciting wide receiver room. Yes, we want to see what the quarterback can do. We want to settle down some nerves, maybe prove some haters wrong in the fan base that were very, very upset by Malachi Nelson not getting that start. Yes, you have maybe one of the most exciting tight ends we've had in a very long time with Matt Lauder. However, while that passing game is definitely going to be part of this offense, you have got to establish momentum in the running game first. This cannot be an offense that comes out and is reliant on that passing game, because it puts too much pressure on a unit that just doesn't have the continuity yet and ignores your biggest asset overall, which is going to be that running game. So for Boise State, they've got to come out and just embrace the fact that the offense will look a little different this year, at least for the first half of the season, and embrace the hashtag Heisman campaign of Ashton Genty and give him the ball. Again, it also has the benefit of preventing overexposing your playbook. If you can win on the ground, you don't have to go into exposing your route tree. So for Boise State, there are a lot of benefits to make sure that they focus on establishing what should be the greatest part of this team, which is the run game. And finally, third key to the game for Boise State is going to be eyes on week 1. There is a massive matchup that is looming, maybe the biggest matchup for the group of 5 overall this season, coming up the following week. A playoff contender in Oregon, a top 5 program, currently ranked number 3, maybe moving up potentially after week 1, a top 5 program in Oregon the following week. But you cannot allow your eyes to shift off of week 1 versus Georgia Southern. This is not a Georgia Southern team that you can overlook. They are going to be dangerous. They have 8 defenders back on defense. They have a third-year head coach. It's a very dangerous road environment going east of the Mississippi, different time zones, hot environment. It looks like it's going to be highs of 92, very, very humid, midday game, 2 p.m. Boise State's not used to playing in those, early afternoon, morning type games. Obviously not a morning game, but early afternoon. They're used to playing at like 8 p.m., kicking off when it's dark outside and the neon blue lights are flashing on the blue. That's when Boise State's used to playing. There's going to be a lot of differences here. There's going to be obviously all the rust that you have to knock off in week 1. So regardless of who you play in week 1, it's always dangerous. But a team like Georgia Southern, they are a true contender. Again, Phil Steele has them as tied for number 2 overall in the Sun Belt in his preseason prediction. So this is a dangerous Georgia Southern team, regardless of the fact of who they are missing. And they are missing some key pieces, especially at that quarterback. Offensive line got hurt for them last year as far as players that they lost. They only returned 2 out of their 5 stars on offensive line, so they're having to rebuild there. But this is a Georgia Southern team that's going to be ready. This is their Super Bowl. This is the biggest game that they play unless they can get to their conference championship game this year. This is their, Oregon is Boise State's big game. Boise State is Georgia Southern's big game. And so you have got to make sure that you are prepared to go and face a Georgia Southern team on the road. It's going to be very, very dangerous and do what it takes to win, whether that's exposing your playbook or not. You're going to need every part of you to come out and at least for the first 3 quarters, get this win in this one. And maybe after that, Boise State will have a chance to pull away. But for the first 3 quarters, and maybe even in the 4th, it is going to be a fight. You cannot overlook this Georgia Southern program. All right, so summarizing overall in a score prediction. Again, I hope that you put your score predictions in already. If you didn't yet, this is your last chance before you hear mine. All right, so Georgia Southern score overall summary here before we get to score prediction. Again, Georgia Southern, obviously a team that's overmatched. Sun Belt, mid-level, traditionally Sun Belt team versus one of the premier programs in their, not just their conference in Mountain West, but in the group of 5 overall. When you look at recruiting rankings, obviously Boise State is coming into this one better program, but there are opportunities here. Georgia Southern returns a lot of key pieces, even if they are missing offensive line and QB. They return their rushing threat, primary rushing threats, 2 out of the 3 top wide receivers, only 5 stars back on offense. But again, it should be a good defensive unit that should put Boise State to the test, especially with breaking in a new offensive system and a new quarterback, new wide receiver room. They should put Boise State to the test, and they also return some weapons on their own. And if J.C. French steps up, and he's the guy, and he has a huge game for Georgia Southern, he could test that Boise State secondary that, again, had a lot of questions from last year. Boise State, on the other hand, again, first-year head coach. Spencer Danielson has been great in bringing that energy level up in the locker room and really changing the culture at Boise State from what had happened the previous 3 years. But again, he is an inexperienced head coach. And we saw last in the bowl game, he doesn't necessarily, as an inexperienced young head coach, he's not always making the right decision every time. Boise State was winning the bowl game until they completely changed their offensive scheme coming into the second half, and it just fell apart. And so again, he is having to make new and tougher decisions, moving from that defensive coordinator to head coach role, and it's going to be a little bit of a learning process. Whether the players are completely bought in or not, whether they are, which they are, whether the players are completely bought in or not, whether or not people will run through a brick wall for him. And again, all of those things are true. You're still a first-year head coach playing in a tough road environment versus a Georgia Southern team and fan base that are going to be pumped up and ready for you. So, again, there are openings, there are chinks in the armor here for Boise State that Georgia Southern could exploit, especially if they can't establish that running game. Maddox Madsen throws a couple of picks, things start to go off the rails early. There could be opportunities. So Boise State cannot allow that to happen. Talking about Maddox Madsen, he got experience last year, but it was never as really the number 1 guy. He only got 1 start. Again, there were games where he got the majority of the reps, but he didn't start them. The New Mexico game was his first start, and he didn't get to finish it because he got hurt. So he's coming back off of an injury. He's been out for a long time. He was playing with a 2-quarterback system where he was splitting reps in practice and not getting full game experience. And so while he got some experience, overall, this is still a new setting for him, and it's his first start on the road and first ever season opening start for him. And so there's going to be nerves out there, and especially, of course, with all the negativity that was out there. That's got to weigh on you a little bit as well, and you want to prove yourself, and maybe that forces you into some situations that you shouldn't, because, again, there's all that pressure, and you want to prove yourself. So Boise State has some weaknesses here that can definitely be exploited. On the other hand, of course, though, you've got Stacy Collins, you got Dirk Cutter. Those two alone should give you massive confidence for both the special teams and the offense. And of course, you have the running attack room of Ashton Genty, Dubar, Sire Gaines, explosive and dominant offensive line, incredible wide receivers, both returning, coming in from the transfer portal, being recruited onto the team, coming back from injury. This wide receiver room is absolutely stacked from the number one guy, which hasn't necessarily been established yet. That's how deep this room is. There are so many guys that could be that number one guy all the way down. I think you're going to see a lot of faces out there on offense. So for Boise State, I do think that they win this game. I think I've indicated that throughout this video, so it shouldn't be a huge surprise. I do think they win this game. I don't think it's necessarily a dominant win. I think this is a game that Georgia Southern stays in for quite a long time. And Boise State, again, is going to need to pull out all the stops to make sure they come out of this one with a good win and doesn't come down to the wire. But for Boise State, I am predicting a win. Georgia Southern will be a dangerous team. I do see them putting up 23 points. But again, I think they're going to have their own working through building continuity on their end that they're going to have to be, there's a lot of rust they have to knock out on their end as well. And so for Boise State, I think they win this game 38-23, so a 15-point spread, couple points above the spread there, which again, like we said, was a 13-point favorite. So I think they do go over on the prediction there for Vegas, and I do think this is a Boise State win. But again, this is not a game that the team or the fan base should be overlooking, and I am incredibly excited for this Week 1 matchup. So thanks so much for watching. Make sure, again, that you put those score predictions. You've already heard mine, so hopefully those were already in there. Any other thoughts, though, that you have on this game? Do you think other key players should have been mentioned? Whether a Boise State or Georgia Southern fan, did I mispronounce your player? Georgia Southern fans, let me know. Just overall thoughts, anything that I did, anything you agree with, anything you disagree. I want to have that conversation with you in the comments section. This is my opportunity. Again, not having the blessing of being able to live in Boise myself. This is my opportunity to be able to connect with you as a fan base. And so put those comments in the comment section below. And little update here. I am finally moved into my new house here. We are waiting for the stuff to arrive, so the makeshift studio look should be going away soon. We should have the whole new Bronco Blameyer studio experience here for you soon, so I look forward to that, hopefully, for the next preview versus Oregon. But thank you again for sticking all the way to the end. Thanks for engaging in the comments, and as always, make sure you like, subscribe, and go Big Blue!